In 1943, a German battery company signed a contract with the SS that included a built-in monthly loss of 80 prisoners to be replaced as needed. 80 deaths per month were written into a corporate supply agreement, like a line item for raw materials. That company was owned by the Quandt family. Today, that same family controls nearly half of BMW. Siblings Stefan Quandt and Suzanne Clatton hold roughly 47% of BMW's voting shares, and they share a combined fortune north of $40 billion, making them the second wealthiest family in Germany. A historian they hired to investigate their past concluded the Quandts were, and this is a direct quote, inseparably linked with the crimes of the Nazis. Between 1940 and 1945, more than 50,000 forced laborers worked inside Quandt factories. One of those factories operated a concentration camp subcamp on its own grounds, complete with its own gallows. For 6 decades after the war, the family offered almost nothing in the way of acknowledgement or explanation. The dynasty traces back to a man named Günther Quandt, born in 1881 in Brandenburg, who took over his father's textile firm around 1900 and turned it into the largest supplier of German army uniforms during the First World War. Profits from that war funded a buying spree across the 1920s, one that brought him the battery maker Akkumulatorenfabrik AG, also called AFA, the weapons manufacturer Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionsfabriken, DWM, which produced Mauser rifles and Luger pistols, and stakes in companies like Wintershall, Daimler-Benz, and eventually BMW. By the time Günther died, his empire stretched across roughly 200 companies. But there is another layer most people never hear about, and it connects the Quandt name directly to the inner circle of Nazi power. In January 1921, Günther married Magda Ritschl, and together they had a son, Herbert Quandt. The marriage collapsed and ended in divorce in 1929. 2 years later, on December 19, 1931, Magda married Joseph Goebbels, Adolf Hitler's propaganda minister. Adolf Hitler served as a witness at the ceremony. The patriarch of the BMW dynasty was the ex-husband of Joseph Goebbels' wife, and their son Harold grew up inside the Goebbels household. On May 1, 1945, Magda and Joseph Goebbels murdered their 6 children together in the Führer bunker before taking their own lives. Harold, the son from Magda's first marriage to Günther, survived only because the British captured him in North Africa, where he remained a prisoner of war. But the Goebbels connection, as shocking as it sounds, is not even the darkest chapter in this story. What Günther Quandt did with his factories is: Günther joined the Nazi Party on May 1, 1933, and within 4 years Göring had named him a Wehrwirtschaftsführer, a leader of the armament economy, overseeing factories that produced batteries for U-boats, torpedoes, and V-2 rockets, along with machine guns and ammunition. Running all of it required labor, and the Quandt Empire sourced that labor through forced conscription on an enormous scale. Joachim Scholtisek, the historian later hired by the family, documented between 51,000 and 57,500 forced laborers deployed across Quandt firms from 1940 to 1945, including Western European civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, Italian military internees, Jews, and concentration camp inmates. And what the family did when survivors came asking for help decades later might be the most damning detail of all. But we'll get there. The worst conditions existed at KZ Hannover-Staaken, a subcamp of the Neuengamme concentration camp, constructed directly on AFA factory grounds and operational from July 19, 1943. That March 1943 contract between AFA management and the SS, the one that opened this video, specified delivery of 1,500 prisoners with a built-in monthly loss of 80 to be replaced as needed. Prisoners at Staaken handled lead and sulfuric acid without protection, suffered lead poisoning, and worked 12-hour shifts under threat of an on-site gallows. Historian Mark Bogeln documented at least 403 prisoner deaths inside the camp, with many more perishing after transfers back to Neuengamme once they were declared unfit for work. And this is where it gets worse. When the war reached its final days in April 1945, the surviving prisoners were evacuated, and among those who ended up stranded near Miesta were prisoners from Quandt factories. On April 13, 1945, those prisoners and others from various camps and death marches were forced into a barn at Gardelegen, then burned alive or shot. More than 1,000 people died in what became known as the Gardelegen Massacre, and the U.S. 102nd Infantry Division discovered the site just 2 days later. Günther's son Herbert ran forced labor operations of his own. At the Pertrix plant in Berlin-Schöneweide, at least 2,000 forced laborers from 16 countries endured hazardous battery production, among them Berlin Jews, women transferred from Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, and Italian military internees. Survivors later described being beaten and forced to drink water from toilet bowls. What happened to Günther Quandt after the war tells you everything about how post-war justice worked for German industrialists, and how often it did not. U.S. forces arrested him on July 18, 1946, and held him at Camp Moosburg for roughly 18 months. A denazification tribunal in 1948 classified him as a Mitläufer, a fellow traveler, the second lightest category available, which essentially meant he had gone along with the Nazis without truly being one of them. That classification set him free. No Nuremberg-style trial ever followed, unlike the prosecutions of industrialists at Flick, Krupp, and IG Farben. Historians point to British authorities in Hanover, who held the most incriminating documents but never passed them along to American prosecutors. Benjamin Ferencz, the former Nuremberg prosecutor, stated years later that, with the evidence now available, Günther Quandt would have been indicted alongside the IG Farben directors. Herbert, an NSDAP member since 1940, the personnel director at Pertrix, and a man personally involved in planning camp barracks, faced no charges whatsoever. Harold, once released from his British prisoner of war camp, installed former Goebbels aides in senior roles at Quandt Group companies during the early 1950s, including Werner Naumann, the man designated as Goebbels' successor in Hitler's political testament. With the past buried and the fortune intact, it needed a new vehicle, literally. By late 1959, BMW teetered on the edge of collapse. Luxury models bled money, the Isetta microcar had grown obsolete, and management had negotiated what amounted to a takeover by Daimler-Benz. Everything changed at a 10-hour extraordinary shareholder meeting on December 9, 1959, when small shareholders uncovered hidden development costs on the balance sheet and voted to block the Daimler merger. Herbert Quandt reversed course, pouring in his own capital against his banker's advice and raising his stake to roughly 50%. A formal restructuring plan went through on November 30, 1960, and the BMW 1500 Neue Klasse launched in 1962, creating the premium sedan formula that BMW still sells today. That rescue didn't just save a car company, it turned BMW into the foundation of one of Europe's wealthiest dynasties. After Herbert died in 1982, his wife Johanna and their 2 children, Suzanne, born in 1962, and Stefan, born in 1966, inherited the BMW stake. Today, Stefan holds 26.8% of BMW's shares. Suzanne holds roughly 21%, and their combined position gives them a controlling interest in a company with a market capitalization between 49 and 55 billion euros. Their reach extends well beyond automobiles. Suzanne Clatton owns all of the specialty chemicals firm Altana, along with stakes in SGL Carbon and Nordex, while Stefan controls the digital security firm Intrust, the logistics company Logwin, and occupies a seat on the supervisory board of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, one of Germany's most influential newspapers. For half a century after the war, This family maintained near total silence about the origins of that fortune, even when directly confronted. A Danish former prisoner of the Stockenkamp, Carl Adolf Sorensen, approached the family in 1972 with a group of fellow survivors, requesting help with health problems caused by their wartime labor. The family refused. When Germany established its National Forced Labor Compensation Foundation in 2000, a program that ultimately dispersed 4.4 billion euros to 1.66 million former forced laborers, the Quandts did not contribute personally, though their companies BMW, Varta, and Altana paid into the fund. That silence held until September 30, 2007, when German public television broadcast a 60-minute documentary called Das Schweigen der Quandts, The Silence of the Quandts. Filmmakers Erich Friedler and Barbara Siebert had spent 5 years excavating archives across Germany, Denmark, Greece, Belgium, and the United States, assembling primary documents showing the 80 deaths per month planning, recording surviving forced laborers on camera, and featuring Benjamin Ferencz declaring the evidence sufficient for a Nuremberg indictment. Greek former prisoner Takis Mylopoulos told the camera, "We were treated terribly and had to drink water from the toilets. We were also whipped." Carl Adolf Sorensen, the Danish survivor turned away in 1972, delivered what became the most repeated line from the entire film. Through tears, he said, "First, they made me their slave, and then they deeply humiliated me. I will never again go there and knock on their door. They will not destroy me a second time." Only one family member agreed to appear in the documentary, Sven Quandt, Herbert's son from an earlier marriage, and his response became an exhibit of its own. His words were, "We need to finally try to forget this. Similar things happened in other countries. The past should finally be laid to rest. That would also be better for Germany." 5 days after the broadcast, 4 family members released a joint statement saying they were deeply moved and pledging to fund an independent historical investigation. They hired Bonn University historian Joachim Schultesek, opened the previously sealed Quandt family archive, and in November of 2011, the results appeared in bookstores as an 1,184-page volume called Der Aufstieg der Quandts. Their own hired historian delivered a verdict that demolished their grandfather's reputation. Schultesek described the Quandts as inseparably linked with the crimes of the National Socialists and called Günther an opportunist who got along cleverly and coolly with every regime. The 1948 fellow traveler classification, Schultesek concluded, was simply wrong, and had investigators possessed the documents now available, Günther and possibly Herbert would likely have faced conviction. On its 100th anniversary in March of 2016, BMW acknowledged that it had operated exclusively as a supplier to the German arms industry under the Nazis, employing forced laborers, convicts, and prisoners from concentration camps, and stated that the suffering this caused remains a matter of the most profound regret. Stefan Quandt broke his silence in a 2011 interview, and the way he framed his answer is worth listening to carefully. He led with a defense before an admission. He said that their grandfather Günther Quandt was no anti-Semite, no convinced National Socialist, and no warmonger, but that he had employed tens of thousands of forced laborers in his companies. He said it was painful to see the role Günther Quandt played in some Aryanizations, taking over firms from Jewish owners to expand his group, and that this was not clear to him before. His cousin Gabriele Quandt, a granddaughter of both Günther Quandt and Magda Goebbels, put it more simply, saying one feels horrible and ashamed. So the silence broke. What came after it tells its own story. The Quandt family did something unusual among German dynasties. They funded and published an academic investigation that demolished their own patriarch, 1,184 pages, confirming that the foundation of their fortune rested on the exploitation of tens of thousands of forced laborers, the Aryanization of Jewish-owned businesses, and a direct partnership with the SS that included planning for monthly prisoner deaths. None of that, critics argue, adds up to accountability. Dutch journalist David de Jong, whose 2022 book Nazi Billionaires examines Germany's wealthiest dynasties, points out that the family has never disclosed any direct personal payment to former forced laborers. Other dynasties, like the Riemanns, have pledged hundreds of millions in restitution. The Quandts have not. The Herbert Quandt Media Prize still bears the name of a man whose immediate responsibility for forced labor conditions appears in the family's own commissioned history, and Stefan Quandt still chairs it. When pressed about the name in 2011, he said that looking at his life's work, he still believed one arrives at an overall picture that justifies awarding a Herbert Quandt Media Prize. The silence broke in 2007 and 2011, but the symbols and the money that sustained it remain largely untouched. The heirs of the company that signed the 80 deaths per month contract now control nearly half of BMW, sit on the board of one of Germany's leading newspapers, and direct hundreds of thousands of euros toward the country's governing political parties. Not because the Quandts carry more guilt than other German industrial dynasties. They do not. But because the gap between what happened and what has been done about it remains wider than it should be. And every BMW that rolls off the assembly line carries that gap with it, a quiet reminder that some silences, even after they have been broken, never fully close.